All right, so here we go. We have a 2009 Chevy Silverado 2500 HD 6-liter gas, 6-speed automatic with a failure of crank, but no start, or it'll crank, it tries to start, it just can't establish an idle and run, misfires, but no engine code, no check engine light so far. If you want to know what resolved the issue and got the truck running again, I replaced the ECM. If you're interested in learning what I did for diagnostics that got to that answer, then go ahead and hang out and watch the rest of this video. Okay, so if you stuck around and you're hanging out with me, I'll go ahead and tell you some history about what happened with my truck. Like I said, it's a 2009 Chevy Silverado 2500 HD. As the weather got cooler this year, I noticed that in the morning when I would start the truck, the idle would fluctuate a couple of hundred RPMs until the engine warmed up and it seemed to go away. Drove it that way for a few weeks, and then it got to the point where if like one day I would drive it and I would come up to like a red light, I'd stop the truck and it would stall. The engine would die, start the truck, drive home. I was concerned about it. At the time I thought that it was a throttle position sensor was the issue, so I changed the throttle body, drove the truck one day and it drove fine, drove it home and parked it. Then the next day got into it, got in the truck, tried to leave the house, couldn't make it out of the neighborhood. It was misfiring so bad, got it turned around, limped it back into the driveway rather violently. Basically at wide open throttle was the only condition it would try to run in. Got it parked, and then really started like a 3-month saga of trying to figure out and diagnose what exactly was wrong with my truck. So it really will boil it down diagnostics wise into a few categories. The electrical system, like main electrical power and ground troubleshooting. Then there was an offshoot sort of rabbit hole into fuel system diagnostics that I'll explain. And then a wiring harness troubleshooting in the engine control ECM wiring harness, and then ultimately the ECM replacement. So we'll go ahead and go through a few of the things. Also, one system that I had to check was the CAN bus, which is the communication system between the different modules that make your vehicle run, or make these GM vehicles run. Okay, so the main symptoms I was working against or diagnosing with was basically crank, but it couldn't maintain an idle. The worst symptom, or the worst thing that I could physically observe, since I didn't have a check engine light, was a chatter or an irregularity inside the throttle body. This is a drive-by-wire throttle body, Gen 4 Vortec engine. You would actuate the accelerator pedal all the way through the stroke, and the throttle body would basically act like it was possessed. The butterfly valve would just bounce all over the place. It would never really go to hardly go to wide open throttle position, and then it would struggle to find closed. So that was when I would turn my key on, my fuel gauge would go right above E, which is because I only had 3 gallons of fuel in the tank at the time. The fuel gauge would just wander, and then it would eventually just peg out past full. I think that was indicative of a failure to communicate between the instrument panel and the ECM. Okay, so in addition to throwing parts of this to try and get it running, I came and, after replacing the throttle body, I checked with a Hobo Freight fuel pressure test kit, checked the fuel pressure at the rail, had 60 psi, so fuel pressure didn't seem to be the issue. Pulled the mass airflow sensor and cleaned it with mass airflow sensor cleaner. None of those things, common issues for stalling or poor idle. Checked for vacuum leaks at everything. Fortunately, this truck is a hydro boost unit. It has very few points to get a vacuum leak besides intake manifold gaskets, but checked these preformed evap, like that's a PCV hose, evap hose. Check those, see if they're brittle and broken, causing a vacuum leak. Replace the throttle body because the throttle position sensors can fail. There's stepper motor control because it's drive-by-wire, so I changed the throttle body, and it didn't change the behavior of how the throttle actuated. So I came in and actually replaced the accelerator pedal. So I thought maybe the actuator, maybe the sensors inside this was feeding bad information to the ECU, and that was causing the irregularities in the throttle pedal, but that did not resolve my issues at all. So at that point I had the truck towed to a mechanic because it was I figured there was either a body control module or an ECM issue or something that I couldn't readily diagnose here in my driveway. So I sent it to a shop, and they had it for a few weeks. They tried a few things, and one thing they figured out, or they discovered, was that I actually had a fuel contamination issue. So I'm going to go ahead and try to splice in, show you guys exactly what that kind of looked like, and then I'll go through what I did for fuel system diagnostics to try and get the truck to run again. Okay, so to start with the fuel system, I disconnected the fuel lines, dropped the tank. There's a lot of videos on there how to do that. I replaced the fuel pump, and I blew these fuel lines out with compressed air. Tried to flush any contamination out of the fuel system. Okay, so in continuation of the fuel system diagnostics, once I had the fuel pump replaced, I had the gas tank cleaned out and reinstalled. I put 3 gallons of fresh, clean fuel in it. Then I came up here to the fuel pressure test port on the fuel rail, hooked a hose onto that to that Schrader valve, and jumped the fuel pump and pumped gas out of the rail. Caught a clean sample. Thought I was in good shape, and the truck still had the exact same symptom: crank, stutters, throttle body chatter, and it wouldn't run. So realized that fuel contamination was a problem, but it wasn't what was keeping the truck from running. So that kind of makes me move into the next stage of the diagnostic process, or troubleshooting process. So after getting the truck towed home from the shop and cleaning the fuel system out and that not making it run, really trying to not stop throwing parts at it, start doing some more purposeful diagnostic work. So that started with checking the engine, main power, electrical, ground connection points and cables. I'm going to walk through that with you and show you what I checked. Starting with battery cables, and these are known to get corroded and cause intermittent loss of power that can have computer issues. So I checked that, cleaned them up. Main fuse, I actually checked continuity from end to end on the cables for the power and ground, and it was less than 0.1 ohm. Cleaned the ground there at the head of the clean ground at the front of the cylinder head. Cleaned the ground here at the body mount, and verified continuity. Cleaned this ground on the body and added a ground cable from the body to the alternator bracket in case the ground on this strap was bad or had a poor connection back there where I really can't reach on the back of that head. clean these connections. This actually goes out to the winch. Cleaned connections here, pulled the fuse block to look for corrosion underneath it. Checked all these fuses to see if anything was blown or there was corrosion in it. These fuse panels can get corroded and need to be replaced. Come back to the fuel system side of things. And there is continuation of looking for ground issues. There's a ground back here on the chassis near the fuel filler neck that I cleaned and verified. And then there's a ground on that body mount, and that goes over to your electronic brake control module, and clean that. Okay, so I've gone over fuel system troubleshooting, main battery power cable troubleshooting. Didn't resolve it, didn't fix the truck, exact same failure. Crank wants to run but didn't. So went to the CAN bus system. So the CAN bus, there's two wires in your harness that it provides communication between all your major modules. In a GM vehicle like this, it talks to the ECM, talks to the BCM, talks to the EBCM, or electronic brake control module, talks to the instrument panel or instrument cluster. So the way you check that is you measure the continuity between pins 6 and 14 of your OBD2 port, and you should have 60 ohms. If you don't have 60 ohms, you have a problem. If you have very low resistance or zero, you have a short. If you have 120 ohms, you have an open or a break in your CAN bus harness, which can be very problematic. I had 60 ohms, which means CAN bus harness was intact, but that doesn't mean that all the modules were okay. So after cranking and cranking and cranking all those times, I finally was able to generate an check engine light or engine codes. Truck would try to run, it would stutter, stall. You would get on the courtesy panel, you would get engine power reduced, service StabiliTrak, get a check engine code, pull that check engine code, and it was a P0606 ECM internal failure. All right, so now that you have a code that says you have an internal failure, you'll go to the YouTube and you'll see 100 videos, and they'll tell you it's never the ECM. It's hardly ever the ECM. It's always something that talks to the ECM or communicates to it that causes the ECM internal failure code. And that leaves you into wiring harness diagnostics. So in order to do that, I downloaded a diagram for this E38 engine control module, the pinout for the connectors, checked and established that I had a clean ground to the ECM and I had clean power to the ECM. Then I actually found the pins for the throttle body, because that was where my main failure symptom was coming from, was the chatter in the throttle body and the irregularity of the throttle actuation. So I actually rang out continuity between the 6 pins. I'll show you. There are 6 pins on the throttle body connector for the throttle position sensor and the actuator motor. And those pins come back into the harness. You probe that harness and you measure the continuity, and I verified that there were no breaks, that there was no breaks in the wiring between the two ends of the two connections. I also had codes generated at the same time for the EBCM. I think ultimately that was because the throttle position actuation was so irregular that it was triggering StabiliTrak. While it was trying to crank, the truck just didn't know what was going on. And also potentially that the ECM having an internal fault, the CAN bus that ping between the two modules wasn't happening. Like, it was pinging the ECM and it wasn't getting a response, and it was faulting out. So we'll go back under the truck and look at the EBCM. So we already checked ground, but I pulled this connector off of the EBCM, checked for power, checked for ground, had clean power and clean ground. Didn't find anything wrong with the harness that I could find. I mean, I don't know, this short of just blowing the whole loom apart and looking for broken wires. So I ordered an ECM. I ordered this ECM that's in the truck off of eBay. Provided my VIN and service number off the stock ECM and installed it. So this is ultimately what got the truck to run. Alright, so you've installed a new ECM in your truck, and you didn't order an ECM that had the VATS disabled, or the vehicle anti-theft system. So you have to do basically a theft. You have to overcome the theft deterrent system. You basically reprogram your key to the truck. This is a failure. This can happen if you leave your battery disconnected for too long, I've heard. It hasn't happened to me before, but I've seen other videos of it. So basically, to reprogram your key to the new ECM and to make the truck think it's not being stolen, you put your key in the truck, you turn the key on, you attempt to start the truck, and you'll get this truck and padlock. You see how that goes off? It's because my key is programmed. But if it stays on, that'll stay on for 10 minutes. And when the light goes off, you try to crank, it won't start. You take the key out, do it again, wait 10 minutes. You attempt to crank, it won't start. Wait 10 minutes. When that light goes off, it won't do it. Take it out, do that again. Keep doing it up to 3 times is what they say to reprogram this key to this ECM. So, and you also, I got a message on my courtesy panel here that said to service the theft deterrent system. So it actually took me 5 tries to get it to work, and it finally cranked, and I was extremely pleased with the truck that it ran. And obviously there's some additional work to do when you replace an ECM. I'm go over that. So another thing that'll happen when you replace your ECM is you're going to get you need to get a scan tool and go in and do a crank position relearn. Otherwise you'll have a check engine light that won't go away. You also want to go ahead and clear all the legacy, all the old DTCs out. So in order to do that test, you plug your scan tool into your OB2 sensor. You'll get prompts on how to do it. I'm not because I don't want to redo that procedure on the truck. It's running fine right now. But that'll be something that you have to do when you replace your ECM, just as a forewarning. Either you need somebody with a tool to come help you out, or get a tool that you can do it with. But ultimately, all those things being said, turn this on, go from a possessed throttle body to truck that runs. My check engine light is for an O2 sensor, so yeah, ignore that. So kind of, wrap things up. sometimes the ECM can be what fails, despite, you know, there are other things that can contribute to causing that P0606 ECM failure code. I'm sure those are, I mean, there are other things like bad grounds and poor, you know, broken harness that can do that. The fuel contamination issue, I mean, if maybe that would have kept it from running, but it was definitely a problem. Just got me kind of sidetracked. Overall, this truck was down for almost a little over 3 months, between trips, you know, the trip to the shop and the tow back home. You know, honestly, if they hadn't found that fuel contamination, I don't know if I would have looked for it. So, you know, good on them for finding that and thinking to look for it. I just checked that I had fuel pressure. So if you know, hopefully this video gets somebody going if they're having the same thing. If your throttle body's starting to act janky and you hear clicking and chatter out of it, man, there you may have something to be worried about. I wouldn't have expected an ECM to fail gradually, kind of the way the symptoms persisted and ultimately failed. You'd expect it to be something that's solid state, just goes. But anyways, hey, thanks for watching. Have a good one.